Dude, that is beautiful. Where are you?
Man, I'm in the this week I'm in the Adirondacks of New York. It's just, I mean,
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. For folks who are watching, you'll see, but Neal's sitting in front of like the most picturesque landscape. It's like a freaking painting, dude. That's amazing. Well, good for you, man. That looks awesome. I am in this beautiful studio, which is a black room, so I would much rather be out there. To start things off, my friend, why don't you give a brief introduction of who you are, what you're all about, and we'll go from there.
yeah, man, I appreciate us making the time for this. I know we've been talking about doing this podcast for a
Yeah.
minute. I've got this kind of, one of the reasons why I wanted and was looking forward to doing this podcast with you is because a lot of the topics that you've been covering over the past year or so keep on just coming up for me as like topics I want to talk to you about.
Okay.
And so for what that's worth, I just want to share with you like the hard work you put in, all the focus you have, like is well received for for the people out in the world.
Oh, well, I appreciate that, man. Thank you.
My background is, I grew up in New York City. So even though I love the wilderness, I grew up in the city of cities, and had a really crazy childhood, but then joined the Marine Corps, served a bunch of years in the Marines, came out, really struggled with the identity of having this big, grandiose purpose of the military and not being able to know what it's like to not have that purpose afterwards. But it really became a gift. Did a bunch of corporate stuff, but then that led me into the tech startup entrepreneur space, did a bunch of crazy things, which we could talk about, or if it's relevant or not to this course, to the podcast, but like really big, significant technical startup, cool New York, San Francisco stuff, right? Around AI, cybersecurity. It led me to doing a bunch of things in cybersecurity globally. So I've got some really interesting views on like what's going on in the world right now, why it actually is happening and stuff like that. And then ultimately really saw how lots of men particularly struggle with trying to understand what their role is in today's world when the world is just reshuffling the deck, I like to say. And so now recently, over the past couple of years, have built an online men's community, got a couple hundred guys, doing kind of mindset, mental, physical, relationship, financial work. And then about 2 years ago, when this whole COVID thing happened, watched how guys particularly were just falling apart because, look, we're used to being the moneymaker, used to being in charge, trying to figure out what it's like to be a dad to a kid, work at home, all these different things. And now over the past couple of years, I've gone really deep into plant medicine and stuff like that for PTSD, struggle, and all that type of stuff. So it's a sorted mixed bag, brother.
Yeah, well, usually that makes the most interesting people. So there's a lot of stuff there we can talk about, and I'm particularly interested in talking to you about the plant medicine stuff and everything you're doing now. You and I have messaged a little bit back and forth on that kind of thing periodically. But it sounds to me like you kind of went from sort of what's the best way to put it? This frenetic sort of hyper productive lifestyle, right? To essentially going into more finding yourself and helping others do the same, and sort of looking inward, which I think is tough for men to do, and especially like you said, when you're up against crises like, oh my God, the world has changed. How do I be the provider I'm supposed to be? How do I, be the man I'm supposed to be? And a lot of times those inward conversations are tough to have. At least I know they have been for me over the years, and it's certainly been an evolution and a process. And I think a lot of folks sort of conflate the concept of toxic masculinity, quote unquote, with masculinity in general. And they assume that this sort of thing isn't part of what makes a man a man. And my opinion is that it is one of the most important things. If I can't have honest conversations with myself internally and honest conversations with the people I love and be vulnerable with them, then I'm not fulfilling my potential as a man. And I think a lot of times people sort of assume that is frowned upon, right? And that you're not considered a real man if you're sort of vulnerable with those sorts of things. And so that's why I really like a lot of the stuff you put out and what you're doing, because you do focus on those things, which I think are incredibly important, right? With suicide rates in men and everything else that we're looking at. So, so military, tech world, startup world, and then coaching. And is that all you're doing right now, full time? You're coaching, or do you do anything else?
Well, I'm a equity shareholder in about a dozen companies that probably cover the full gambit.
Gotcha.
Of things we talked about. So, still play in the cyberspace, do some stuff in artificial intelligence, but doing a lot of stuff in this plant medicine space, because I really think it's going to be, if cannabis was the gateway drug to legalization versus gateway drug to addiction, I really think that in the work that I've done with plant medicine and the people I've worked with, that this is going to be a huge shift for people. And I think that, one of the biggest things, like in a lot of the work that I've done, when I first, and I know this too, because I've heard you talk about this on other podcasts, it's like when I considered getting into this coaching world, like the 7-8 figure Lambo crypto NFT investor real estate thing, it's just a weird world, right? But I really feel that people are now adopting what it's like to actually understand what it's like to have a coach. Like, unless you played like a Division I sport and you understand what it's like to really have a coach on the sidelines who's actually looking at the things you're doing, watching the way you do it, giving you a system and a framework to get past it, it's hard for you to even conceptualize what it's like to have an actual coach. And for me, when I started to get into this space, I thought, shit, I got all this experience behind me, all this capacity to share it. I was a little bit of a masochist for about 15 years, beat myself up in the process, but made a lot of money, learned a lot of things, and really just want to figure out how to not have to put people through these gauntlets in order for them to learn some of this wisdom. So how do I do that? And it's funny because a lot of my coaching practices, and the way I kind of operate and work with people now, I couldn't get behind coaching frameworks. It's like this idea that, hey, Dave, if you do Neal's A, B, and C, and you do it my way, you're going to get 1, 2, and 3 as the result. Like, doesn't work unless you're working with a formula for a business. That can totally work, right? Like for your gym, you can do what someone else's gym is doing. You do it well, you execute on it, and for the most part, it's going to go the way it wanted, unless there's an outlier to it.
Right.
But the outlier in one-on-one coaching is everyone's got their story and everyone's got their bullshit. And what I ended up doing was going back to a group of people I was working with that are archaeologists that study like indigenous peoples, humans, and all these different things. And I went back to them with a lot of the stuff and said, all right, thousands of years ago, we still had alcohol, we still had tobacco, we had war, we had suicide in some capacity, had anxiety, had all these things. Why is it all screwed up now? Like we've been doing these things for thousands of years. And so a big piece of the work that I've now gotten into is really leveraging kind of practices, rituals, understanding real problems versus fake problems, first world problems versus like real problems, and really building practices around that to support people, especially men, to be like, this thing you think is a problem is not really a problem. So get rid of it. Let's go find a real problem. Let's go figure out what your real problem is, whether it's mindset, leverage, or efficiency, or a formula. Master that real problem, and then these other problems will fade away.
Got you. Okay. I was about to ask you, like, what's an example of something someone would perceive as a fake problem and then the underlying real problem, but you kind of got at it right there at the end where you said it could end up being something like mindset or et cetera.
Yeah, well, let me just jump in and give you a good one because it's relevant to a lot of the stuff going on in the world today.
Okay.
Like, I've got guys in my community, right, that if you reference even by accident on our group coaching calls. Something related to the vaccine, something related to politics, something. You just reference it. They literally go off a cliff, with their own version of that, their own feelings towards it, their own stance on it. And what I subscribe to, what I've been taught by a lot of people I work with, is the only reason why a person behaves in the way that they behave when it comes to those type of topics is resources. If you have enough resource, so for the guy that's complaining, I know his inner struggles. He is an older guy. He's used to being on a certain side of the politics. He's used to having a certain stance he can believe in. That's been eroded and whittled away for him. And now the guy's not making the money that he was. So rather than focus on his mindset, focus on getting the right resources in place, focus on himself, it's just so much easier to get caught up in these propaganda machines and then blame the world why you're not doing the thing that you're doing.
Right. That makes sense.
Which is a big problem.
Yeah. I think in general it's an escape for a lot of people to focus on politics or even sports or things like that when the effort should be put towards improving something in their own lives. And I mean, you even see it on social media, especially when I look at, say, people who take the time to comment on my posts with hate, right? Or to message me all mad about something. Those people in general, sometimes I'll take a peek at their profile just because I'm interested, wow, what is going on in this person's life that they hate me so much, And almost every time without exception, they don't have a lot going on. They for the most part, when it comes to stuff like that, people don't punch down. Right. And so what I always tell people who are dealing with that, like internet trolls, for example, because this is related, is, there's something going on in their life that they're not remedying. There's something that they're insecure about. And that's why they're focused on trolling you or talking shit on your post, because it's way easier for them to do that than to look at the real problem in their life. And it sounds like this is sort of a similar concept to what you're talking about. A lot of times men will get fixated on a perceived problem, say, again, politics or whatever you want to pick, when really it's because they're avoiding a real problem. I think that's a very common theme. I'm curious, though, about the plant medicine stuff, and just in general, for someone who might know might not know what we're talking about. When you say plant medicine, what are you referring to specifically?
Yeah, man. So there's this whole. Let me organize my words for a second here. I'm going to be 44 this month, and for anyone who's probably 38 on, who was witness to the Reagan era and the classic TV commercial of "This is your brain on drugs" with two fried eggs going in the background, right? There was this whole war on drugs, and every single drug on the planet was labeled as a bad thing. And over the years, of course, cannabis leading the front of that, we've done a lot more research and started to process that a lot of these medicines or plant-based things that have some kind of impact on us have some medicinal values to them. And there's been studies that have been done, that were done around psilocybin, which is a mushroom, and a bunch of other ones we could talk about. But basically, if you suffer from PTSD or trauma or depression or all these other kind of different classifications or labels, that if traditional frameworks and therapy are just not working, there's this whole push now for people to do more things like microdosing and what they call hero doses, which is larger amounts of it, ultimately for the idea of being able to kind of unpack and let go of the thing that's holding you back from getting in your way. And as somebody who, has been big in the personal development space, for a couple of years, I was doing all this Tony Robbins stuff and going to all the events. And I think they're all very powerful if you don't have the knowledge and are looking for the formulas. If you don't have the formulas, you should go to these things, you'll get the formulas. But then when it comes down to putting the formulas in place, for me, what I found was I struggled because of some other stuff I was going through my own head. And I participated in a bunch of plant medicine ceremonies. And immediately it was like, whatever was in my head that was getting in the way of me doing these things, it was like I was on a path and there was these little pebbles on the path that just, I would see a pebble and I couldn't move it out of the way. And that would limit me from getting to where I wanted to get to. And the plant medicine ceremonies and then going into microdosing afterwards just made the pebble disappear. And I just became this huge advocate for it and sent me down this path of, in 2020, I microdosed for the full year. I mean, using a full protocol, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. But I basically microdosed everything you could ever microdose in some capacity. Learned a lot about the tools, learned about how to use it, learned about why to use it. Because sometimes I think people use the wrong microdose for the wrong thing and then wonder why they got the circumstance that they got out of it. And I've just become a huge advocate for it.
Now, when you say microdose, for those who might not be aware what that means, you're talking essentially a sub psychedelic dose, right? That's taken in small quantities daily. In psilocybin, for example, the result of that would be what? Because you're not getting high or getting tripping, but what are the benefits of that microdose?
Yeah, so most of us have a relationship or experience of going to a festival, eating a handful of mushrooms, right? LSD, MDMA, smoking weed, whole bunch of other ones out there.
So I've actually only done MDMA and cannabis. I've never experienced psilocybin. I've never experienced LSD. I've never experienced DMT. So I'm kind of at the stage in my life where I want to experience a lot of those things as I get a little older and more introspective. So this is why I'm extremely interested in this topic, by the way.
Yeah, man. No, I love it. And so when we're talking about microdosing, we're talking typically, to get super technical, 0.3 to 0.5 grams of a substance every day.
Okay.
And can be consumed in multiple forms: a tea, a chocolate, whatever you want to do. But let's use psilocybin, for example. There's psilocybin is usually used for people who just feel too much pressure during the day, and they want to get a little bit looser and get a little bit more creative. Lots of military veterans, for example, will want to play with their kids and just don't have the mindset to sit there and play with Legos for 4 hours after work every day.
Yeah.
So what do? But they want to be with their kid. They want to be an impact on their kid, but they just can't. So what do? They go through their work day. Every day they come home, 3 or 4 o'clock, they take a microdose of psilocybin. It drops them out of their head and into their bodies a little bit. The next thing you know, they're playing with Legos with their kid for the afternoon, and they love their kid, love their family a little bit more, and get to experience that.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. That's a really good example of how, especially for guys, right? Because we're not wired to do that. We're home all day. It's really struggle. It's a struggle for us when, prior to 2020, we were off doing whatever the thing we were going to do. And now we're home with our kid every day. Just different for us.
Yeah. 100%.
Right. And then there's other ones, but basically if the current circumstance that you're in keeps repeating itself from a mental perspective, and you don't feel like it's the right thing, or it's like a Groundhog Day, keep on repeating a cycle, then plant medicine, what I found in microdosing, is a great way for you to take it off of that pattern and start to put a new pattern in place. Okay.
Now, I had always heard the sort of creativity angle of it, and I've actually heard that with psilocybin specifically, even in communities like Silicon Valley, the startup tech community, apparently microdosing has gotten really big for that reason as well. When we're talking, I guess you would call it a macro dose or a larger dose that does achieve a psychedelic effect, What would be the utility of something like that versus microdosing? Like, when would you say, okay, it's time for you to have that experience? Is that when you are up against larger obstacles in life, or instead of just breaking the monotony, you're trying to break through something bigger? When would you kind of want to do something like that?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It is called either a macro or a hero dose.
Oh, I have heard hero. Yeah, that's like what, 5 grams or something. I think
yeah, people will do 4, 5, 6, 7 grams of psilocybin. I think it comes down like you're saying. My word around that would be it comes down to the intention.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started to do this work, I think we struggle with this idea of calling anything a medicine because of what pharmaceuticals have now taken the word medicine. So we subscribe to this idea that if I take these 2 pills, even if it's aspirin, I'm going to feel a certain way for the next 6 or 8 hours, and then I got to take more.
Right.
And plant medicines operate in just a very different way. And when I microdosed for a year, I started to really look at them as no different than if you had a screwdriver, a hammer, a socket set.
I see.
All the tools,
different
right?
Tools
and it's
for
just like
purposes.
The first time you pick up a socket set, every single human, whether you're a kid or whether you're an adult, you're like, what the fuck does this thing even do? It's
you're
weird.
Swinging it around because it sounds
swinging
cool.
it around, don't know what it does, right?
Yeah,
but after you've taken some things apart and put them back together, you're like, hey, give me a 3/8, let me do the thing. And you're like, can do it with your eyes closed.
Right.
It's the same exact thing with plant medicine. I look at it more as tools. And I look at the hero or the macro doses as like, if you're really struggling to figure out why you're stuck, if you're like, I'm just stuck, I can't let go of this thing, right? The microdosing is really good for either, finding creativity, finding ways to let go of your day, finding a way to start your day, like all these like little, it's a good hack, I would say.
Yeah.
Now the macro, like the way that some of the healers and facilitators I work with is what they call the mushrooms, the psilocybin, is they call it Los Niños. And it's meant to be like this childlike feeling. If you have a childlike thing, you want to be playful, you want to be joyful, you want to have fun, you want to let go, great. Then they have the DMT based, psychedelics, right? Which is ayahuasca, bufo, 5-MeO, DMT. And these are more of like meant for like hardcore forgiveness. They call them the grandmother plants.
Okay.
That is, you want to cry your eyes out. You want forgiveness. You want to get kicked in the nuts and be told you could do better in your life. That's the route that I suggest people go into, which is something we do in a lot of the men's retreats that I work with. Then the other one in the big hero macro dose really is the cactus, which is called the grandfather plants, which is going to be mescaline based, which is going to be peyote or San Pedro or some other cactus. And that's really like productivity, clarity, focus, right? That's the Indian plant they would take before they go to war, right? That's the one you want to beat your chest with. You don't want to go drink the grandmother before you go to war, right? You want to get the one that's going to give you the slap in the back of the head to be like, get your shit together. And I think that's a lost art form that I'm working with people to figure out about. If you use the wrong tool for the wrong thing, of course you didn't get the right answer.
Right. Yeah. It's all very interesting to me, and it's something I want to experience. And I had Andy Lewis on the show last year. He owns Norse Fitness, and he had gone and done an ayahuasca ceremony down in, I believe it was in Peru, and it just completely changed his life. Like he says it's basically, he went from this sort of bitter, kind of just miserable person to literally changing in every way. loving life, embracing life, waking up every day grateful. And when you hear stuff like that, man, you're just like, holy shit. It's fascinating that a single experience can have, and this was a while back for him now, and he's still experiencing those effects. Like it was like a switch went off and it changed him completely. It's pretty incredible. But I also do think about the fact that if, like you just said, you're not using the right tool for the job, and the wrong switch goes off, and and something is changed for the worse in someone, and it's like that forever as well. I know a lot of people experience, like with cannabis, for example, just to talk about something I have familiarity with, quite a bit of familiarity. The paranoia is really scares people. But for me, I enjoy it, because for me, it's sort of a heightened state of awareness. And if I embrace that and say, the paranoia is coming, let's see what we can do with it. It's that self-awareness and really like harnessing it. I enjoy it, because I start thinking about all kinds of interesting things and stuff. So with DMT, for example, or was DMT a grandmother molecule? Or
yep.
Okay, yeah. I'm just like, is that an experience I need to have? Because I want to have an experience like what Andy had, but I'm already kind of an optimistic, sort of grateful person, and then I'm like, well, would it be of benefit for me to have something more intense, like peyote, for example? So I just don't know. I think a lot of people are kind of in that purgatory that I'm in, and I'm also like, well, I guess maybe I'll just try to experience all of it and kind of see what happens. But what would you say to someone kind of like me, who's I've only ever experienced MDMA once, and that was at a friend's bachelor party, right? And then I've done a good amount of cannabis, and that's it. And I'm I'd say relatively productive individual, all of this stuff, but I'm just kind of looking for, I don't know, maybe that little change in perspective, or that little just boost in creativity, or what have you. Is something like DMT going to be of detriment to me? Like, would I go do it, and then could it create negative changes in my life? Because you always hear about these transformations for the good, but is there a kind of a dark side to that? If kind of like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it type thing?
Right. No, so there's a term in this work. There's a couple terms that come up for me. One, there's what's called an ayahuasca zombie. No pun intended to your Halloween zombieism. Yes. But this is basically, just to give you context around that, this is a person who's got deep trauma and just thinks that if they keep on going back to the medicine, right, it'll fix it for them. Right. And what ends up happening is you have to ultimately be wanting to do the work, right, involved in all this stuff. And, what that entails really is, one, I've become such a huge advocate for, like, again, the people I work with that serve these medicines and provide the resources for it. I am not that person. What I am is really good at guiding people and preparing them for this experience, and then helping them integrate whatever it was afterwards. Got you. Okay. And I feel like that's the answer, is like, it is so important for you to have proper facilitation for these things. Hands down, that's the first thing that comes up for me. The second thing is, though, that said, there is no biomechanical, biological, whatever other bio word you want to throw around it. What's interesting about these ones we're talking about, the peyote, the mescaline-based, psychedelics, the psilocybins, and the DMTs, they do not have addictive natures to them. Right. And does that mean that somebody who's got an addictive personality can still get addicted to it? Totally. Right. But it comes down to, those pieces. What I find the metaphor that I've been taught is like, you know, and I think this is partially what you're probably starting to experience now, is that naturally when men get to be between like 35 to 45, whatever, you know, somewhere around that age bracket, right? If you think about your body as a house,
Mm-hmm.
you've now built this house, right? It was the foundation was built by your family, whatever that circumstance was. You then built the house through college and then through whatever life you've had. And at some point you sit down in this house and you go, something just doesn't feel right in the house. And our natural belief is to change our aesthetics. So we start to work out more. We start to run marathons. We start to run the Spartan race. You know, we go, you know what? I've done these things. It still doesn't feel right in here.
Right.
And then you go, all right, well, what other aesthetics can I change in the house? And you run around, you try and change all the aesthetics. You lose weight, gain weight. Not you particularly, but some people go through divorce. They get a new wife. They have another kid. You know, all these different things. You go, the house is still not right. I can't get it right for some reason.
This is the canonical midlife crisis, basically.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And for those people who feel drawn to explore more about the house and get over the rewards of the external, well, then the plant medicine ceremony allows you to go into your quote unquote basement, into your subconscious, and see what in the foundation just is not sitting right. And that part you're talking about with Andy Lewis,
Mm-hmm.
right, where he had some kind of mechanism or something in his basement, either a pattern that was instilled by his parents or a circumstance or whatever the thing was for him, that he was able to then shine a light on it and then go, aha, this is the thing that's getting in the way of me being a certain way.
Right.
Removing that, which is something you just cannot do consciously in a psychedelic hero macro experience, and then being able to realize that you can wake up every day and be grateful and happy and all the things that he talked about.
Yeah. Okay. So when you put it in that context, it does seem a little less likely that you might have a negative experience that continues on after. It sounds like it just allows you to sort of examine yourself and see what's out of place, which I think is beneficial in many ways and can be no matter what your circumstance in life, I suppose. When you talk about DMT, you see this a lot where people talk about the elves and interdimensional sort of beings and stuff, and you hear very intelligent people sort of talk about the possibility after they've experienced DMT that it could be in somehow opening up your ability to experience and communicate with another dimension, sort of adding another sense to you and enabling you to see kind of something that's there all the time, but only when you're experiencing the DMT can you actually see it. Is this something you know much about, or I'm sure you've heard this kind of thing before?
Yeah, I mean, like if you talk, you hear Joe Rogan's experiences, you hear Aubrey Marcus's experiences, you hear all these different people's experiences, and I've had my own experiences, and the way that I've kind of worked with people and processed that is throughout these psychedelic experiences, you will experience the modalities of your belief system.
Okay.
What I mean by that, right, is like if somebody fundamentally believes in aliens, right, and you go into a psychedelic experience, your body may deliver that information back to you through alien experiences. If you believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you might see Jesus because that's the way your body is responding, your mind is responding back to sharing that information back to you. Now, what's interesting about the plant medicine ceremonies, especially the men's retreat weekends that we do, is we go really deep into setting up everybody for a very holistic experience. And so what that entails, and this is why it works for a lot of people who go to Peru, is like you got to put the phone down, right? You got to stop texting your families. You got to stop looking on social media. You got to like clear the plate so that whatever type of experience you need to have isn't being kind of sandbagged by the last text message that you wrote. And so like when a lot of people talk about elves or unicorns or even, all kinds of different things, there's the modalities of how they're receiving the information, which is just what your belief system is. But then I've done work with this. I've actually tested myself on this, where I've been through it while I was being facilitated. I would purposefully focus on certain types of information and then have a psychedelic experience, and then totally experience only that thing because that was the last thing that was in my mind for the last 40 minutes before I did it.
I see. Okay. I just always would hear elves, and people talk about seeing elves, and I'm like, that's a very interesting theme. So for me, for example, I don't think about elves normally. It's not something that I, would be just kind of lurking around back there. And then so if I were to experience DMT and then see elves, but then I got to thinking, well, now that I know that is something people see, if I go experience DMT, it's already sort of there. And I wonder if that's the phenomenon, that there's this sort of circulating idea that you see elves that everyone hears of. And then, of course, they see elves when they trip on DMT. And I'm like, man, that's probably more likely. That's the most parsimonious explanation, but it's a lot less cooler than seeing interdimensional beings that you're communicating with.
What they say basically, and what we prep people on when we facilitate these events, is there's 4 types of experiences. The first one is where you experience your version of God in some way, shape, or form. The second version of it is what they call pintas, which I would put elves or jaguars or lions, or you experience some kind of animal or some kind of beast of some kind. The third one is you would see, hear, or feel past or present family members. And the fourth one, which is the most interesting one and kind of intriguing one, is you actually consume the plant medicine, you go to sleep, and you actually experience nothing at all. And what that is, and I have experienced that twice, is that it's your mind actually sharing back to you that you have nothing to work on right now. You're fine.
Interesting.
And it becomes this like weird, humbling gratitude of being like, there's nothing I got to work on? Nothing?
Yeah, like that's disappointing. Because you're like, man, I know I'm a fucking mess. So, yeah, that would be kind of weird. I'm almost afraid of, and this is why I think I need to do it, because I'm like, there's so much shit going on up here, and it's such a mess probably that it's kind of scary thinking about actually doing DMT or something like that in what I would actually see or experience, which I think is, again, why I should probably do it, because there's some things I need to work out. But what, man, so many questions. You said you work with how many men right now?
Yeah, so we have, I think it's like a little bit over 500.
Oh, wow.
Or so in the community.
Okay.
We run an online virtual community group. Guys who are working on mindset, lots of high performance CEOs of companies that, are so busy being in charge all day long, they don't get a place to have an outlet.
Right.
But then on the flip side of that, they're in these group community calls with, military veterans, PTSDers, all kinds. And then once every probably about 8 weeks or so, 8 to 12 weeks, we have a men's retreat weekend. Every other one is plant medicine. Then we do some other thing like mountain climbing weekend, scuba diving weekend, something like that. But the whole idea is that really teaching men how to trust each other.
Okay. Yeah.
Like like what I found in my research, one of the biggest challenges for men right now in the last couple of years is the whole world is shifting, right? People are making money through, people will say, I don't trust crypto, but yet some other guy's making money through crypto. Somebody will say, I don't trust this side of the government, but yet they're doing amazing things with the other side of the government. And so I've been really working and building a marketplace for men to trust each other, because in the community, what I adopted the principle of is everything moves at the speed of trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it acts right, if it feels right, if it looks right, you'll do business with a person. But when stuff goes sideways, and it turns out that person, especially in the entrepreneurial world, in the coaching world, and the online influencer world, when shit hits the fan, in business and in community, we've got to be able to support each other and be like, as long as that person did the best job they could based on the tools and resources they had available to them at that time, shit just happens. And so a big piece of the community is built upon retraining men to trust each other, and we do it through them trusting themselves.
Makes sense. Yeah. It has been an interesting couple years for men. I mean, I think it's been an interesting probably decade for men, but I think a lot of people are sort of becoming aware of a lot of these crises that men specifically do face. And when you look at the stats, it's undeniable, you know, because a lot of times what I'll experience is talking to people, especially say females or people who are, what's the best way to put this? A perceived member of some disenfranchised community or fringe community or disadvantaged community, or someone who's on the extreme left or something like that. As soon as I start to talk about the crisis facing men, it's this sort of, they laugh it off, write it up, you know, like, oh, poor men, boo-hoo, whatever, you guys rule the world. And that's a little frustrating, because I get in my inbox all the time tons of young men who are dealing with all kinds of mental health issues, and I mean, it truly is sad to see. And
yeah.
even personally, I've talked about this on my social media quite a bit. I when I was sort of at the peak of achievement based on paper or the outside, you know, that's when I was in the deepest, darkest pits of despair mentally. And I've talked about it a lot, but I almost took my own life, and I know you've experienced that as well. And so, you know, anyone who's listening, especially if you're a man, I mean, take this stuff seriously. You know, working on you is very important, and it doesn't make you less of a man to do so. It makes you more of a man, I think, is what people need to know and understand. And man, I've had some awesome conversations with young guys who essentially are afraid of embracing all of who they are. Let's say they're a hyper-competitive male, or what you would sort of historically or traditionally consider like an alpha type of male, right? They're very competitive. They're an overachiever. They're type A personality, whatever. And they feel like they can't express the full extent of that being because it's frowned upon in society these days as toxic masculinity or whatever you want to label it. And a lot of young men deal with that and are very cognizant of that and afraid to embrace who they are in this society that sort of demonizes that type of behavior. What would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, I love this part, Dave. So thank you for going down this path. You know, two things come up for me, one indirect and one direct. The indirect one is, you know, you're absolutely correct that probably about the last 10 years or so, right? A big piece of why I shifted getting into this work was really because of my daughters. Because as they're getting older, right? They're 14 and 10. You know, like I started to see what that was like. And while I'm a huge fan of equal rights and women's empowerment, as this blueprint of women's empowerment is being rewritten, right? They can make the same money, they can, you know, manage a house and have kids and work from home and do all these things. The challenge is that the blueprint of a man being needed is being erased. And there's not enough change maker men who are being like, look, you can be the gun guy, but you can also be in touch with your feelings. You can be the outdoors guy and be the guy who knows how to eat good sushi in New York City. You can be all these things. But men, more than anything, we need to be needed.
Yeah.
And that's just a hard thing for guys to wrap their heads around. And for anybody who walks around with this like toxic masculinity, men are fucking up the world kind of behavior, or men rule the world, you're talking about a very, very small percentage of people. When, you know, and this is all stuff you already know, but just for anyone listening, like, men have the highest suicide rates, men have the biggest drug addiction rates, biggest alcoholism rates, more men in prison than women. We have more men have more problems. And a big piece of that is that early on in our life, if we weren't taught ways to be utilized and way to be resourceful and ways to be needed, then we just struggle with that. And so, you know, how do you change that if that's how you're feeling? Well, you got to kind of be willing to try things, right? Like, you got to be willing to be like, look, am in this part of my life and none of this seems to work or makes me feel gratified in some way, shape, or form. So you got to try something that's going to make you feel like you've actually done something, right? There's a whole big conversation in there about getting into finding a purpose. You know, I mean, I think Simon Sinek has fucked up that word for everybody, but like, men finding a purpose and finding a reason why you want to do things is so important, more so now than ever, because a lot of the belief systems that I could subscribe to when I was 25 are just being eroded right now. So you got to find something to believe in yourself for yourself. Yeah,
I agree. And I would also say it's tough to do, but you have to find a way to, at least I have in what I do. And part of it is probably my age. I've gotten to the point where I don't give a shit what people think about me. Truly, I could not fucking care less. And you have to find a way to get there as well, especially if you're a young man, because some of the mistakes I made as a young man were caring too much about others' perception of me and worrying that I wasn't coming across as, let's say, sophisticated enough. For example, when I was in grad school and surrounded by all these people who were intellectuals, you know, even though I did circles around a lot of them in the lab and research and stuff. But, you know, I wanted to look the part. And I think that a lot of times we fall into that trap too, about caring so much about what others think about us. And then when you couple that with the fact that society is sort of pivoting at this stage and demonizing a lot of these traditional male roles, at least demonizing them for men. However, when women embrace them, it's brave and beautiful and bold. You know, it's kind of this weird place where you just have to be comfortable enough in who you are to look past the noise, and that's really tough when you're young, because I struggled with it a lot. And you always hear the cliche, I wish I knew then what I know now. I mean, everyone wishes they knew then what they know now, you know. But I can empathize with young men today who are dealing with that. And it was sort of, I think, I'm a little younger than you. I'm in my mid-30s, but I think my generation was kind of like the last wave of us who didn't deal with the true onset of a lot of these like postmodern critical theories and stuff that are driving a lot of this anti-male rhetoric. And so I feel for those guys, but I don't know if there's anything else you'd say to someone like that who's maybe, I don't know, in high school or something like that. And it's like, what do you do? I mean, besides be yourself, I don't know. I guess I'm just thinking out loud here, but it's an issue, man.
No, you know, I think it comes down to, you know, and you're right, like your generation is the generation that I don't even like to say it like this, but at least you experienced 9/11.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And even like, this is going to be interesting, I think, with what's going on in the world right now, because, our country and even our world, right, is basically operating off of a playbook of what the governments all feel comfortable to do, whatever that is. And like, when I was working within cybersecurity, I did a lot of global governmental stuff and worked a lot with these policies that are in place and how the playbooks operate. And so, bringing this back to, I don't know about I don't know about anybody else, but like, anybody who is feeling like alpha masculine behavior is not healthy, if they were out at a bar or club and it got crazy, you would want that alpha masculine guy to step up and protect you from the circumstance.
Of course.
And I think we're going to start to be seeing stuff like that happening, where like, there is behavior that is being demonstrated. And I actually don't believe that toxic masculinity is a thing as much as it is because the true masculine kind of traits are actually the exact opposite of toxic masculinity. And toxic masculinity is men who are operating from a place who don't have the right tools and haven't been shown the right resources,
right,
in order for them to operate from a place of accountability, integrity, safety, security, protector mode. And, they're actually operating from a very feminine place, regardless of how they physically look. This, like, there's a piece of my content that I teach around masculine and feminine embodiment, and that like ragey, out of control phoenix behavior is really like a feminine quality and trait, which is supposed to be a good thing. It's about how you nurture men in order for us to focus on our shit. And look, I'm a man in a relationship, you're a man in a relationship. There's times in our relationships where our women do some crazy thing and they blow up and do something, and the next thing you know, we're like, you know what, she's fucking right. And we needed to hear that in the moment. But when some guy does that because he doesn't know how to articulate himself in order to get what he needs out of life, or to be seen and heard because he can't figure out how to do, right? That's a big piece of it. And I think that men need to, if for anybody who's a high school person or a young person, like, you got to learn how to do, and it'll just work itself out.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was talking to, I can't remember who, maybe it was my buddy Stu Brower when he was on the show, and we were talking about how there's really a bifurcation in the population that's pretty distinct, essentially producers and consumers. I mean, all of us produce and consume to an extent, but there are those of us who majority produce and those of us who majority consume. Like, for example, talking about social media as an easy example, I was telling him that I basically post what I post. I create my content and I'll reply to some comments on my stuff, but that's it. I'm not scrolling and looking at a bunch of other posts and commenting on other people's posts. I just don't have the time for it. So mainly I spend my time producing my content. But then there are a ton of people who use social media only to consume. They're not producing any worthwhile content or any content at all, and they're just scrolling and consuming others. And I think that we've seen a large shift in the population, especially in young people, going back to sort of what you would say to high school boys. Most of them are just consumers, flat out. We're just consumers. And I think being a producer and just doing, as you put it, they kind of go hand in hand. A lot of young people today are very passive and in consumption mode because they've lived lives where they've had everything just sort of there for them. And you make a good point saying that my generation was the last generation that truly experienced 9/11 because I was old enough to take it all in and to know what it all meant and all of that. And then since then, it's been, at least in America, I know people internationally listen to this show, but talking about America in general, it's been largely a very good, nice, passive, lazy, easy life for the majority of Americans. And I know there's someone punching the air right now because they've had their struggles in the last 15 years growing up. I'm not saying it's been easy for everyone. I'm saying relatively speaking, right? Like we've been enabled to be largely inactive consumers in this country, and nobody's getting up and getting after it and being a doer as far as the younger generations go, like they used to anyway. And I think that's a large part of it. And so, those listening, the advice that Neal's giving, it's so good. Like, just do stuff. Get up and do stuff. Try stuff. If you have never played a sport, go play a damn sport. If you've never tried to build something out of wood, go try to build something out of wood. If you've never hiked a mountain, go do that. If there's a whole world. Like, do things and experience things. And I think that's going to help you figure out who the hell you are too.
Yeah, and I think even I'm shifting into this belief system as well, right? Like, even like this beautiful background that I got here, right?
Yeah,
this is not where I live. I live a 50% digital nomad kind of lifestyle, and the other 50% of my time I'm with my kids. Right. But like a big piece of it is like, go rent an Airbnb for a week and go to an amazing place and do an amazing thing. And there's young people that I know in my network that are 16 years old that are flipping Yeezy sneakers and making thousands of dollars a week,
for sure,
so they can go and do cool things. There's kids that are 19 that are millionaires because of crypto. And like, we live in this age where, like, especially because of this, like, if you can figure out how to be a producer versus a consumer for the most part, it's the largest distribution center of things on the planet now. And you can literally make money doing, I go through this with my own children where I'm like, I don't know if I need them to go to college or not. I'd rather spend $100,000 on building a business for them and having them have it, whether it's them starting their own, NFT thing or, a distribution center or whatever it is. But then this is where, like, the language I used to begin the podcast, like, if you are struggling with, something and you can't even figure out what it is, just get yourself resources. Mm-hmm. Get resources and I look at currency and money in today's world. It's just a resource for you to get access to other things.
Yeah. And often the pursuit of resources can give you enough meaning to propel you forward through whatever that sticking point has been too. Like, if you're just kind of floundering and life sucks or whatever, and I just feel numb and yada, 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 which, we've all experienced that to an extent, that complacency. Oftentimes when you say, okay, Neal said, obtain resources, how do I do that? What's my plan? That in and of itself is enough to give you enough action and enough direction and a goal in life to propel you forward. And then you might find all of a sudden, I chose trying to wholesale real estate. I actually really love it. And whatever that issue was has kind of resolved itself, because now you're being a productive person, creating resources for yourself and those who depend on you, if there are any who depend on you. And that can be the case too. So I think anything to break that complacency is good, man. And that could be, like you said, acquiring resources, or let's say you've got resources and you still feel complacent. I mean, you've just got to find some purpose and some meaning, right? And maybe that is going to result from, again, sampling a bunch of different things, doing different things, getting out of your environment. If you live in a small town or a rural area, chances are you've probably driven everywhere. You drive around in your car. Get out and walk around your small town. It'll be completely different. It'll look completely different. It'll smell completely different. It'll sound completely different. And that in and of itself can be enough to help. I've actually done that before. Like, I grew up in a rural area, and when I was in high school, I always, once you get to a certain age, teenage years, you're just driving everywhere, right? Because driving's new and it's cool and everything. But then I got out, and me and a buddy of mine walked to like our little downtown area, and I remember that day vividly now, 20 years later, because I was like, wow, I've never experienced where we live like this. It's so different when you get out and walk around. So even little shifts in perspective like that, if you're attuned to it, You know, if you're cognizant of the fact that you need that perspective change, that can be the little kick in the ass too.
Yeah, man. I appreciate that.
So anyway, what else, my man? I know you've got so much going on. The coaching thing. So a lot of people with the coaching industry in general, and I've coached nutrition for several years. I did it for free for several years because I just loved doing it, and I wanted to build my cred, I guess, if you will. And then I turned it into an actual business after that. And now I don't coach anymore because this thing's taken up so much of my time and everything. But oftentimes when people hear a coach, right, they're immediately thinking of multi-level marketing type stuff, you know, sleaze bags. Or for me, I think of, and this drives me nuts because I see so many business coaches who have never owned a damn business and are barely old enough to know anything about the world, selling their services. And how should someone go about vetting a coach or finding the right coach for them, or knowing that the coach is legit, since you're in that world?
Yeah, I love this question, dude. One, I think coaching as a business is a terrible idea.
Why is that?
And I say that from a place of, like, as somebody who's got other businesses,
yeah, right.
And I'm building an online community, right? And I think as somebody who coaches, I often just tell people, if you're doing this for your primary source of income, don't.
Right.
Like, and the reason for that is it's not scalable, it's not repeatable, and any good coach, I think, fundamentally should recognize that after you coach the person through the things, they should ultimately leave you.
Yeah.
Like, I look at it like the best example, of course, of coaching is from an athletic perspective, right? So a junior high school coach who's coaching somebody into high school coach, who's coaching somebody maybe into collegiate stuff, who's maybe coaching somebody into the Olympics, let's just say. Right? You fundamentally have to be able to support your person to go away from you.
Right.
And I'd say the first step is having a coach who actually can support that idea. Right?
That's
not like, I'm going to coach you for 10 years.
Right.
Like,
right.
That should not be a thing. And then the second piece, you hit on the nail ahead. If you want coaching on, you know, business, then you should be able to look at their business track record. Right? If you're looking at mindset, you know, then you should be looking at some kind of mindset, you know, track record. I mean, I personally fundamentally believe there's only 3 types of coaching. You can get coaching on leverage, which is sales and marketing. How do I get leverage in a conversation, in a business or in a conversation? There's the efficiency, which is all business formulas. You know, how do I do finance? How do I do acquisitions? How do I do revenue splitting? Stuff like that. And then there's mindset. It's only the rest of it, whether it's dating, finance, relationships, whatever the little niche-y thing is, doesn't matter. But those are only 3 types of coaching that really exist.
Yeah. Yeah, you make good points. I really like the first part about the coach being willing to move on once they've achieved whatever the goal is with their client, because I think a lot of coaches sort of just look at a client as a revenue stream, and their goal is to keep you on board as long as possible. So I think that's, for those listening, that's a great conversation to have with a coach is, look,
now there is a world of coaching that I think is interesting, that if you're a coach that you have dozens of coaching clients and you can recognize a new thing that your collective needs, and you offer completely create the next evolution, right? If you're a high school coach and you knew a bunch of your players were going into high school, and you created or into college, and you knew that they were going to have the pre-college, you know, athletic program, and then you could evolve those people into the next group, like that, for coaches who are doing that, that's very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually had a teacher in elementary school. I think she taught 3rd grade maybe, but she loved us so much, our particular cohort, she moved up to teaching 4th grade so she could stay with us for another year. So it's kind of like, it's kind of that. She had to learn all those new lesson plans and stuff, but it was worth it for her. But yeah, I think those of you listening, in general, I'm a big fan of coaches, especially if you get to a certain point in the game where you're trying to learn a very specific niche. For example, this is different than mindset coaching, obviously, but for me, I've seen a lot of utility as I start this apparel company. To buy the time of someone who's been there and done that is hugely worth it to me, right? To sit down with someone and say, okay, here's where I am in my process, and then just to talk about it. Or, if you're trying to achieve a specific nutrition goal, a coach who can work with you and point you in the right direction. And I mean, it's very valuable if they know what they're doing, but you've got to ask these questions to vet people. And I would say, don't be shy in the beginning to ask your coach those questions, because especially if they sort of have this air of arrogance where they're offended that you're asking them questions, that's an immediate red flag. Because I have no problem answering any questions you ask me about nutrition or whatever it may be. And that's because I realize that I'm looking to help you in that area, and you have every right to ask me questions. But that said, once you do decide to work with a coach, and I think this is an important part, is you've got to trust them. You've got to trust their judgment. You've got to trust their plan. You've got to execute on what they have you execute on. And this for me was one of the big reasons, not saying I would never do it again, but if I had to pick one thing I liked the least about nutrition coaching, it was adherence by the client to the plan, right? And so there's only so much you can do if they're just not following your plan. And I would interview people prior to bringing them on, and when I would hear something like, yeah, I've worked with 5 different coaches, none of them could give me the results I was looking for, I'm like, well, that's a huge red flag. So let's talk about how closely you followed the plan they wrote and all that stuff. But I guess I'm saying all that just to say, if you are looking at working with a coach, guys, I mean, make sure you're prepared to truly work with the coach and do what they advise you to do, and take it seriously. Because as a coach, as a nutrition coach, it was tough if, let's say, I had someone who didn't adhere to the plan, and then I decided, I mean, I had a few that I decided it was no longer a good fit. And I was just like, hey, I don't think I'm the right coach for you. We're not progressing like we should. I've your last several check-ins, you're clearly not doing the things you should be doing. And I don't want to take your money if you're not going to execute on this plan. But then you'll have people like that who say, yeah, I worked with Dave and he wasn't a good coach. I didn't get results. And so it's tough. So just be mindful of that, I guess. It's difficult waters for folks to navigate, I think, in selecting a coach and working with a coach and everything. And it can be amazing and life-changing, or it can be a terrible situation if you're not careful.
For sure. I completely agree with you, brother.
Yeah. Do you personally have coaches that you work with who coach you?
Yeah. So at any given time, I have 3 coaches.
Right. I figured most good coaches have coaches.
Yeah. And I would say that even like most of my, like, if I was going to pick my top 10 coaching clients, and someone asked me, well, what makes this top 10 operate the way that they do? Right. And fundamentally, it's that they have more than 2. They have 2 coaches or more. Usually it's like a coach and a therapist, 2 coaches in 2 different categories, or, something along those lines. But like, I have been through the gauntlet, I guess, on coaching, where I've had great coaches, I've had good coaches, I've had mediocre coaches. And so I champion everything that you just said and agree with it. It's like, one, if you have clear expectations on what you're looking to get from the coach, right? Teach me something I don't know, right? Is a good one. Or, give me accountability and adherence over the things that I say I'm going to do, because we all need a little bit of accountability in our lives. Or don't go looking for a coach because you actually need a therapist.
That last one is good too. because I can't tell you how many people would unload on me as their nutrition coach about their marriage and everything else that's going on. And I'm like, look, man, here's your macros. Good luck with that. But that's so true. And I think that therapy is amazing, and speaking specifically to men, because I know we can be reluctant oftentimes to do that. I've seen a therapist. My wife and I have seen a marriage counselor for therapy. It's great having someone to talk to. And again, this is not admitting defeat as a man. This is being a better man and improving and sharpening your axe. So what else did you want to discuss, my friend?
No, I think we covered the full gambit, Dave. I feel good about the podcast. I think we covered a lot. Anything come up for you?
Is that water behind you, or is that snow? That's snow, right? Okay. I thought for a second that was a reflection, and I was like, "Holy shit, it's a lake!" And I didn't realize until now. But no, man, I love it. I could ask questions about the plant medicine, all of that, forever, because it's an area that I'm very interested in exploring at this stage in my life. But I think if nothing else, guys, take from this that you're not admitting defeat by seeking help, by seeking coaching, by seeking guidance, and especially in today's culture and in our society that has sort of shifted in terms of the paradigm of how men are viewed in the traditional roles of men. Don't let that dissuade you from being who you want to be, I think is important. And Neal, I ask every guest this before I wrap up, and I'm going to ask you the same. You've already given a lot of great advice, but if you had to give one piece of advice to young people today, let's say men or women, just young people in 2022, what would that piece of advice be?
I would say that the piece of advice I would give is that if you feel like you have an emotional problem right now, first, try and identify if you actually have a math problem that you need to solve before emotional problem.
Okay. What do you mean by math problem?
So let's just say, for example, you're lonely. Like this is a good, funny way to say it. Let's just say you live in the Adirondacks in the middle of nowhere, and yet you're lonely. And you start to self-deprecate that nobody likes you, okay, you're not good enough, or all these other things that we all go through at some point in our lives. But it turns out the math problem is you just don't live around enough of the right people.
Got it. Okay.
There's probably a math problem beforehand before you can actually, because a math problem you can solve. An emotional problem can send you in different places. And I think a lot of people in today's world, myself included, I've been there, will tend to look for the emotional problem before we go looking for the math problem.
That's great advice. Yeah, I agree completely. And a lot of times it's hard to even see that it's a math problem unless you're specifically trying to tease that apart, I think. So
yep.
Great advice. Neal Conlon, if people want to find you, where should they look for you, whether it's for coaching or just to follow you on your social or plant medicine or all of the above?
Yeah, man. For all of the above, www.nealconlon.com or on social media handles. I think they're all I am Neal Conlon.
Okay, and for folks just listening, that's N as in Nancy, E-A-L. So it's spelled a little differently. And Conlon is C-O-N-L-O-N, correct?
Yeah, man.
All right, perfect. All right, my friends, until next time, keep your minds free.
All right, appreciate it, brother.
Thanks, brother. Bye-bye.